Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are all about becoming better thinkers.
Letter thinkers is.
And our guide for this deep dive is the book summary, Asking the Right Questions, a guide to critical thinking.
A guide to critical thinking.
You know, in a world overflowing with information these days, it's really easy to feel overwhelmed,
Yeah.
like drinking from a fire hose.
Yeah, but
So this deep dive is going to be like strength training for your brain,
right.
helping you sift through it all and make smarter decisions.
It's like a superpower,
Yeah.
especially when you think about how easily we can be swayed by a compelling story.
Oh, yeah.
The book summary actually opens with a pretty shocking example
Okay.
involving a congressional hearing where this young girl, Naira, I think her name was,
Okay.
she gave this really heart-wrenching testimony that later turned out to be completely fabricated.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wait, really? What happened?
So her story was about Iraqi soldiers taking babies out of incubators.
Oh, my.
And it was so emotionally powerful that it really influenced public opinion and even played a role in the U.S. decision to go to war in Iraq.
Wow.
Yeah, but it was later revealed that her testimony was essentially staged propaganda.
Oh, my gosh. That's scary.
It's a scary thought.
That's a powerful reminder of why critical thinking matters.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not just about being skeptical,
Yeah.
but about being able to discern the truth from fiction,
Yeah,
especially when the stakes are so high.
especially when the stakes are high.
Yeah.
And that's where the book's concept of two thinking styles comes in.
Okay.
So it describes this passive approach called the sponge method, where you're just soaking up information without really questioning it.
Like a sponge soaks up water.
Exactly like a sponge.
Okay.
But the real key is to adopt what they call the panning for gold approach.
Panning for gold. Okay,
Yeah.
I like that. So instead of just blindly accepting everything,
Yeah.
you're actively sifting through the information,
Right.
looking for those valuable nuggets of truth.
Those valuable nuggets of truth. Exactly.
That's a really good analogy. I like that a lot.
Think about it this way. You probably wouldn't invest in a stock just because a friend told you it was a good idea, right?
Right?
You would do some research.
For sure.
Look at the company's performance.
Yeah.
Consider the risks.
Yeah.
Weigh the rewards.
Absolutely.
So in a way, we should approach information with that same kind of scrutiny.
So it's like we should be treating information like we're making financial decisions
Yeah.
with that level of importance.
Exactly, because the choices we make based on the information we consume can have a huge impact on our lives,
Oh, yeah.
from the products we buy to the candidates we vote for.
Absolutely. Okay, so how do we become better gold panners when it comes to information?
So
What are some practical steps we can take?
one of the most important is to be aware of your own thinking process.
Okay.
Notice when you're just passively absorbing information versus when you're actively questioning and analyzing it.
Got it.
It's like building a mental muscle.
Building a mental muscle. I like that. Yeah.
So it's about being more conscious of how we're processing information and then making that deliberate effort to engage with it on a deeper level.
Exactly. And that leads us to another crucial aspect. Understanding the obstacles that can trip us up when we're trying to think critically.
Okay.
Even when we have the best intentions, our brains love to rely on these shortcuts that can lead to biased or flawed reasoning.
You mean like those moments where we jump to conclusions without considering all the facts? Yeah, I've definitely been guilty of that.
Oh, we all have.
Uh,
The book summary dives into some fascinating examples
okay.
of these mental pitfalls, and it all starts with our natural tendency to think fast,
Think fast.
relying on snap judgments and intuition to conserve our mental energy.
Well, thinking fast isn't always a bad thing, right? Sometimes you got to think fast.
You're absolutely right. There are definitely times when quick thinking is necessary.
But when it comes to more complex issues or important decisions, that thinking fast can lead to those knee-jerk reactions that prevent us from seeing the bigger picture.
Right, so it's about recognizing when we need to slow down and engage that more analytical mind,
Yeah.
even if it takes a little more effort.
Exactly. And once we've acknowledged that tendency to think fast, we can start to identify some of the other common obstacles that often accompany it.
Okay, so let's talk about those obstacles. What are some of the pitfalls that we should be watching out for?
Well, the book summary uses a really relatable example of a parent who's unfairly critical of their son.
Okay.
And it highlights how thinking fast can often lead us to fall into the trap of stereotypes and assumptions.
I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this example. How does it illustrate those pitfalls?
So the summary describes this scenario where a parent sees their son playing video games, while his sister is diligently studying,
Okay.
and the parent immediately jumps to the conclusion that the son is lazy and unmotivated,
Oh.
without even bothering to ask why he's not studying.
Ouch. I can see how that would be frustrating for the son. It sounds like a classic case of jumping to conclusions based on a very limited snapshot of the situation.
Exactly, and it highlights how that thinking fast can lead to those unfair stereotypes.
Right.
We see one specific instance, and then we generalize it to an entire group, or even an individual's entire personality.
It's like judging a book by its cover.
Exactly.
Or in this case, judging a person by a single moment in time.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And to make matters worse, the summary points out how this snap judgment can then be amplified by something called glittering generality.
Glittering generality. Okay, you've definitely piqued my curiosity now. What is that?
It's basically when we latch on to one positive or negative quality and let it overshadow everything else.
Okay.
So in the parent-son example, the parent is fixated on the son's perceived laziness
Uh-huh.
and completely ignores any other positive attributes he might have, like his artistic talents or his kindness towards others.
Ah, I see. So it's like we're putting on these mental blinders, focusing only on what confirms our pre-existing beliefs or biases.
Exactly, and this tendency is further compounded by another obstacle: belief perseverance.
Belief perseverance.
It's like that stubborn friend who refuses to budge even when presented with solid evidence to the contrary.
Well, I know that type. Yeah.
So in the example,
Yeah.
the parent simply doesn't want to hear any justification from the son because their mind is already made up.
It's like they've already written the story in their head,
Right.
and they're not willing to let any new information change the narrative.
It's human nature to some extent,
Yeah.
but it can be really detrimental to critical thinking.
Yeah, for sure.
It takes a conscious effort to step back and consider alternative perspectives, even when they challenge our deeply held beliefs.
So how do we break free from that tendency? How do we become more open to different viewpoints, especially when they clash with our own?
Well, the book summary suggests a few strategies, and one of the most powerful is simply being aware of our own biases. Once we acknowledge that we all have these preconceived notions, we can start to question them more effectively.
That makes sense. It's like shining a light on those blind spots in our thinking.
Exactly. And another key is to actively seek out diverse perspectives.
Okay.
Don't just surround yourself with people who agree with you all the time.
Right.
Challenge yourself to engage with viewpoints that are different from your own.
I've heard that called getting out of your echo chamber.
Yes.
It's like stepping outside of your comfort zone and
Yeah.
exposing yourself to new ideas and information.
Precisely. And that leads us to another obstacle that can really distort our perception of reality: the availability heuristic.
Ooh, that sounds intriguing. Tell me more.
It's basically a mental shortcut where we overemphasize information that is easily accessible,
Okay.
like a recent news story or a vivid personal experience, and we use it to form conclusions about a broader situation.
So it's like judging an entire restaurant based on one bad meal you had there.
Yes. Or assuming that all politicians are corrupt because of a few high-profile scandals.
Right.
The availability heuristic can really skew our perspective,
Yeah.
leading us to make generalizations that simply aren't accurate.
Okay, I'm starting to see how insidious these mental shortcuts can be. They seem so harmless on the surface, but they can really lead us astray if we're not careful.
Absolutely. And the list of obstacles doesn't stop there. The book summary also touches on egocentrism,
Egocentrism.
which is the tendency to overemphasize our own experiences and opinions,
Oh,
thinking they are more important or valid than others.
so it's like that saying, everyone thinks they're the main character in their own story.
Exactly. We all have a tendency to view the world through our own lens.
Uh-huh.
But it's important to remember that our perspective is just one among many.
Right.
Critical thinking requires us to step outside of ourselves and consider other viewpoints.
That's a great point. It reminds me of a quote by the author Anais Nin. We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are.
That's so true. Our perceptions are shaped by our own experiences, beliefs, and values. And that's why it's so crucial to develop those critical thinking skills,
Yeah.
to challenge our assumptions and to be open to different ways of seeing the world.
Okay, so we've covered some pretty significant obstacles to critical thinking. It's starting to feel like we're up against a whole army of mental biases and shortcuts.
It can definitely feel that way.
Yeah.
But the good news is that the book summary doesn't just leave us hanging with a list of problems. It actually provides us with some practical tools and strategies for overcoming these obstacles.
Well, that's a relief. I was starting to feel a bit overwhelmed by all those mental pitfalls. So let's move on to the solutions, shall we? How do we actually start to dissect an argument and evaluate evidence effectively?
That's a great question, and it's where the summary really starts to shine. It provides this simple yet powerful framework for breaking down any message, whether it's a news article, a political speech, or even a casual conversation.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more about this framework.
It's all about identifying the three core components of any argument: the issue, the conclusion, and the reasoning.
Interesting. So it's kind of like a detective story.
Yeah.
We need to identify the problem, figure out the proposed solution, and then examine the evidence that led to that solution.
Exactly. The issue is the topic being discussed.
Okay.
The question that's being addressed. It might be explicitly stated, or it might be implied, requiring us to read between the lines a bit.
The summary uses the example of vending machines in schools to illustrate this right.
You got it. The issue isn't stated outright, but we can infer it from the context. Should schools allow vending machines that sell sugary drinks?
Huh.
Are those vending machines contributing to childhood obesity? Those are the underlying questions that are being debated.
Okay, so once we've identified the issue, the next step is to figure out the conclusion.
Right.
That's basically the author's stance on the issue,
Huh?
their proposed solution or answer.
Precisely. Sometimes the conclusion will be clearly stated, often using indicator words like therefore, thus, or in conclusion. But other times, we need to deduce it from the overall message, looking for clues within the text to figure out the author's main point.
It's like piecing together a puzzle, looking for those subtle hints and connections.
Exactly. And then comes the most crucial part, the reasoning. Yeah. This is the evidence, the logic, the chain of thought that connects the issue to the conclusion. It's the why behind the author's stance.
This is where we really need to put on our critical thinking caps, right?
Yes.
We can't just accept the author's reasoning at face value. We have to scrutinize the evidence presented.
Yeah.
Look for any holes in the logic and consider whether there might be alternative explanations.
You nailed it. The book summary emphasizes the importance of clarifying key terms.
Okay.
A single word can have multiple interpretations.
Uh-huh.
So it's crucial to understand exactly how the author is using certain words.
Right.
We also need to examine the underlying assumptions, those unspoken beliefs that the author might be taking for granted.
It's like being a detective looking for those subtle clues that might reveal a bias or a flaw in the reasoning.
Exactly. And speaking of bias, the summary cleverly connects this back to the Naira story we discussed earlier.
Right.
It highlights how easily we can be swayed by emotional appeals, especially when we don't stop to question the source of the information and the motivations behind it.
That's a powerful reminder that critical thinking isn't about being cynical or distrusting everyone, but about being an informed and discerning consumer of information. It's about taking responsibility for our own understanding of the world.
Absolutely. And that responsibility includes acknowledging that there might not always be a single right answer.
Mm-hmm.
The summary introduces the concept of exploring alternative conclusions, even when the initial reasoning seems solid.
So it's not just about poking holes in someone else's argument,
Right.
but also about being open to the possibility that there might be other valid perspectives, even if they challenge our own assumptions.
Precisely. The summary encourages us to embrace uncertainty, to get comfortable with the idea that there might be multiple valid perspectives on any given issue.
This all makes me think about the importance of asking, what if?
Yes.
It's about pushing past our initial assumptions and considering different scenarios, different outcomes, even if they're uncomfortable or challenging.
That's such a powerful tool for critical thinking.
Yeah.
It helps us break free from those rigid thought patterns and explore new possibilities.
Yeah.
It's like opening up a whole new world of understanding.
Okay, so we've talked about dissecting arguments and exploring alternative conclusions. But what about the evidence itself? How do we know if the information we're encountering is reliable? How do we determine whether the data actually supports the conclusion?
That's a crucial question, and it's what we'll dive into next.
Yeah.
The book summary offers some practical guidelines for evaluating evidence, helping us become those savvy gold panners we talked about earlier. So how do we know if the information is reliable? How do we figure out if the data actually supports the conclusion?
Yeah, that's the big question. It's like everyone's throwing data around these days. How do we know what to trust?
That's where we really put those critical thinking muscles to work.
Okay.
The book summary gives us some practical guidelines for evaluating evidence, and it all starts with understanding the language being used.
Okay, so like sometimes you read something and you're like, wait, what does that even mean?
Exactly. The summary encourages us to pay close attention to key definitions, because a single word can have multiple interpretations.
Oh, for sure.
So we need to be sure we're all on the same page.
Right. So it's not just about understanding the dictionary definition of a word, but also how it's being used in the specific context of the argument.
Precisely. And beyond the definitions themselves, we also need to be aware of those hidden assumptions, those unspoken beliefs that might be influencing the author's reasoning.
It's like those terms and conditions that nobody reads, but that can actually have a big impact on how something works.
That's a great analogy. Sometimes those underlying assumptions are so ingrained that we don't even realize they're there.
Right.
But they can significantly shape the way we interpret information.
So it's like we need to be constantly asking ourselves, what is the author taking for granted here? And are those assumptions valid?
Exactly. And once we've clarified the language and examined the assumptions, we can move on to evaluating the data itself.
Okay, so let's talk data. What are some red flags we should be looking for?
First and foremost, we need to consider the source of the information.
Okay.
Is it coming from a reputable organization, a peer-reviewed journal, a random blog post?
All right.
The credibility of the source can tell us a lot about the reliability of the data.
So it's like checking someone's credentials before you hire them for a job.
Uh-huh.
You want to make sure they have the experience and the expertise to back up their claims.
Exactly. And beyond the source itself, we also need to consider the methodology used to collect the data.
Okay.
Was it a large randomized controlled trial? Or was it a small anecdotal survey?
Right.
The methodology can have a huge impact on the validity of the findings.
So it's not enough to just look at the numbers themselves?
Yeah. We need to understand how those numbers were obtained and whether the methods used were sound.
Precisely. And even if the methodology seems solid, we still need to consider the sample size.
Okay.
A study with a small sample size might not be representative of the larger population.
It's like trying to predict the outcome of an election based on a poll of just a few hundred people.
Uh-huh.
You need a larger sample size to get a more accurate picture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And finally, even if the data itself seems sound, we need to be critical of how it's being interpreted.
Okay.
Are there any alternative explanations that haven't been considered? Is the data being presented in a misleading way? Are there any potential biases at play?
This all ties back to the idea of active thinking,
Yes.
of engaging with the material rather than just passively absorbing it. We need to be willing to challenge the information presented to us,
Right.
to ask those tough questions.
Absolutely. And sometimes those tough questions lead us to uncomfortable conclusions.
Yeah.
It's tempting to cling to our existing beliefs even when the evidence suggests otherwise. That's where the concept of strong sense critical thinking comes in, right?
Yes.
It's about being willing to critique all assertions, even our own cherished beliefs.
Exactly. If we're wrong, we need to be willing to admit it and adjust our thinking accordingly.
Right.
That's the hallmark of a true critical thinker.
It's about having the intellectual humility to acknowledge that we don't have all the answers,
Right.
that we're always learning and growing.
Precisely. This entire deep dive has really highlighted the importance of being aware of our own biases,
Oh.
those mental shortcuts and emotional triggers that can cloud our judgment.
Yeah, it's so easy to fall into those traps.
It is.
Especially when we're not paying attention.
Exactly.
It's about recognizing those patterns of thought that lead us astray.
Uh-huh.
Those tempting traps of oversimplification and confirmation bias.
But the good news is that critical thinking is a skill that can be developed with practice.
Oh, that's good.
It's like exercising a muscle.
Yeah.
The more we use it, the stronger it becomes.
So it's like anything else. Practice makes perfect.
Or at least better.
Yeah, exactly.
right.
And the rewards are well worth the effort.
Absolutely.
Critical thinking empowers us to make more informed decisions, to navigate this complex world with greater confidence and clarity.
It's about becoming more discerning consumers of information,
Uh-huh.
more responsible citizens,
Yeah,
more effective communicators.
absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's one key takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
I'd say the most important thing is to simply be curious.
Be curious. Okay.
Keep asking those questions.
Yeah.
Challenge your assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
Seek out diverse perspectives.
Ugh,
Don't be afraid to change your mind when presented with new evidence.
that's great advice. Critical thinking isn't about being cynical or negative.
Yeah.
It's about approaching the world with a sense of wonder and a willingness to learn and grow.
And remember, it's a journey, not a destination.
Yeah.
We'll never be perfect critical thinkers,
Right.
but we can always strive to improve.
That's it for this deep dive, folks. We hope you've enjoyed this exploration of critical thinking. Remember, the power to think critically is within each of us. It's a skill that can be honed and a habit that can be cultivated. So keep those questions coming and keep those minds engaged.